Jesus is in the desert being tempted by Satan, and Satan says, if you just bow down and worship me, I will give you all of this land. And Jesus says, worship God and serve him only. And yet, throughout the Gospels, Jesus is worshipped and he accepts worship. So he must be God, right? Few things to note.
Alex is getting into the claim that Jesus doesn't receive worship like God receives worship. And so here is his claim.
Well, okay, actually, the first important thing to note is what the word worship means. It's difficult to define even in English, but in Greek, there are two words that are typically translated as worship in the New Testament. One is proskuneo, and one is latruo. Proskuneo just means to sort of bow down or prostrate yourself before a higher authority. Latruo tends to refer to like cultic religious worship of the kind that you might give to God. In no instance is latruo worship given to Jesus in the Gospels. There is arguably an ambiguous case in Revelation. We can get into that, but it's not a historical source anyway, and also it's not clear if Jesus is actually being worshipped there. But in the Gospels, not once does latruo worship occur, being given to Jesus. So we're just left with proskuneo worship. Now, proskuneo, like I say, just means to bow down or prostrate yourself before somebody else. So if only God is supposed to accept worship, then let's look again at that Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. Remember I mentioned it earlier? Mm-hmm. Throughout the Septuagint, the word proskuneo comes up all the time. Lot worships two angels. Jacob worships Esau. The whole assembly of Israel worship King David, proskuneo, King David. Like this throughout the gospel, throughout the Old Testament, there are tons of instances of proskuneo worship being given to other people.
So it's a different type of
in the New Testament. Jesus tells a parable, the unmerciful servant who comes back to his master and he proskuneos before him. He just falls at his feet. And so in some instances, it is just translated as falling down at someone's feet, because that is what proskuneo literally means, right? And so proskuneo as occurring to Jesus doesn't mean it's worship of the kind that we would say is only due to God. It's just literally bowing down in front of somebody. Another thing to notice, this is really important. How many times does Jesus accept worship in Luke's gospel? 0. It doesn't happen once. The word only shows up 3 times, twice in the temptation in the desert, and then once after Jesus ascends, his disciples worship him. But that's after he's gone, so he can't say anything about it. And crucially, that particular verse of them worshiping him is contested in our manuscript tradition. There are some manuscripts we have that don't have that verse. Mark's gospel, the earliest gospel, how many times does Jesus accept worship? Twice. Happens twice. Okay, so it does happen twice. But one of those is a demon, Legion, who, if you read most translations, he sees Jesus and the man runs at Jesus and throws himself down at his feet. And it doesn't say he worshipped him. Some translations will say that, but usually it's like he fell down at his feet, because that's what it means. The only other instance of proskuneo in the Gospel of Mark is Jesus being worshipped when he's being mocked by the Roman soldiers.
This, to me, feels like an outdated argument that I'm surprised it's still being used. I know it's a popular argument and we need to address it, but I almost feel like in bad faith he's making this argument. So I like that he, first of all, narrowed it down to this word proskuneo and say, if this isn't being used of Jesus, therefore worship of Jesus is not happening. So here's the idea. If it's not being used to describe it, but it's happening, then it's happening. So if
That's a great point.
So if Thomas is saying, my Lord, my God, it's not saying, and they proskuneoed or whatever, or it's not being used in some form. It's saying, no, he actually did, though. He said, my Lord, my God. What is that? Acknowledging Jesus as God. So it's just like I feel like it's a bad faith argument. Like, this is not the only one of 2 Greek words. Like, if you know Greek, this is not the only 2 words. You can do praise, extol, bless. Also, there's a lot of other ways to acknowledge that Jesus is God other than worship. Now, he's clearly worshipped in more than just the instances he gave. He's worshipped by his disciples, of course, in front of him. He's acting like it's only when he ascended and he wasn't there to say, no, don't do it. Right. Like he would have done that to Thomas. Thomas, don't worship me. I can't be your God because there is only one God. No, Jesus did this all the time when he goes, only God can forgive sins, and I just forgive that man of sins. What is he doing? What is he saying then? Like there's so many other ways, which I want to almost get into those, but if it's just worship, that's not fair.
Let's let him continue here.
Sorry, I have a question. This won't jibe with the proskuneo stuff that you were saying, but when he said God said, you are also God,
Yep.
to the group of people, have you read the autobiography of Yogi?
No.
It's a Hindu guy who becomes a yogi, and he says essentially, yogi is a man who achieves God-like, not status, but God is within you and you've realized it. You've reached that place. He says Jesus is a yogi. Muhammad is a yogi. These guys are people who have achieved that, and they would have a following, and it kind of proves that we can all do this thing.
Yeah.
Does that jibe with what I'm hearing from you?
So that jives very heavily with what I think Jesus is doing. Christians will deny that interpretation because they think Jesus is the guy. He's like a very unique kind of person, God himself in the flesh. I'm much more in line with this, that Jesus is somebody who is essentially the idyllic example of what a faithful person should be. And there are lots of reasons why I think that.
If he's only focused on proskuneo, how about we focus now on the statements of Jesus? So it's not just people's reaction to Jesus, because obviously there's a lot of different reactions to Jesus back then like there is today. But what did Jesus claim? And he does not let you believe, hey guys, I'm here to like kind of set the tone on how to live. It's not just that.
Yeah.
He's not just an example. He's clearly, I've come to save. Like, I am the resurrection and the life.
Yeah.
I am the bread of life. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and life. I mean, it goes on, I'm the door. Obviously, these are statements that he's connecting to. I mean, they're all different because like one might connect to his eternality. He's the bread of life. He's the source, the meaning, the root. Like, he satisfies.
Yeah.
Obviously,
So what he tries to do is he tries to say, he pulls out a mundane example where a different character is asked a mundane question, and he answers the question by saying, are you going to that town? I am.
yeah.
And he goes, well, look at this. Here's an instance where someone's clearly not claiming divinity. They're using that same phrase.
He's allowed to give that argument, but you can still be wrong. So you can give that argument, but here's what I would say.
Right.
The 7 I am statements are connected to some sort of divine attribute of God. And then I would even say when Jesus rested in the garden and he responds by saying I am, and John is like, and they fell backwards, which is very unique. Like just him speaking alone those words, there's a physical reaction to that. I find that interesting. I find that worth exploring. Yeah. And I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, again, it's almost like the Old Testament left us hanging. When God says, I am that I am. And then Jesus goes, I am. And let me fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And I actually think Jesus is intentionally filling up on that, Exodus, who is the great I am? And he obviously is clear now. So whether it is the phrase that he wants specifically, I'm sorry, it's not maybe what you want specifically,
Right.
but is clearly tied to the attributes of God.
Well, it's funny because they started out this podcast. I didn't play this part, but they started out talking about John the Baptist and his ministry and the shape of it, and how some of his disciples, 2 of his disciples, actually became Jesus's disciples, and they talked about it in a certain level of detail, but notably, they left out the fact that John, when he sees Jesus, says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." That is a huge part of the story. If you're going to be if you're going to have integrity in dealing with the story, you need to address that.
Of course.
But I do think it's important on the proskuneo point. I'll wrap that up just because I know I banged on about worship, but it's important because remember how we started, where I pointed out that in Luke and Matthew, Jesus is speaking to Satan.
Mhm.
And Satan says, worship me. And Jesus says, worship God and serve him only. So why does Jesus say that if worship is something you can give to other people? This is where this is something I think is really interesting. If your interpretation is Jesus is saying there that you should only offer proskuneo worship to God himself, then all of those people that I just mentioned sinned. Lot sinned, Jacob sinned, the whole assembly of Israel sinned when they bowed down towards David. So that can't be it. So what's going on there? Well, notice how that's phrased. And he's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, which actually doesn't say the same thing. It's kind of weird. But Jesus says, worship God and serve him only. He doesn't say only worship God. He says worship God and serve him. Let's look at the Greek. The word proskuneo, worship God, and then serve him only. So the word only is affixed to the word serve, not worship. Can you guess what the word in Greek for serve is there that's translated into serve? Latruo.
Which is the other.
Which is the other one, which is the cultic religious worship that's usually only given to God or some kind of divine figure at the very least.
So even in the language of the Gospels, there is a division in the idea of worship.
So it seems in that instance, my interpretation is Jesus is saying, worship God because he's a higher authority. And he's rejecting Satan's worship. He's saying, I'm not going to bow down to you because you're not a higher authority over me. And it's written, I worship God. Also, that's not written. It's really weird. He's quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, but Deuteronomy 6:5 says something like fear God and serve him only. It doesn't say worship. which is an interesting implication. If he's rendered the word fear as worship, it can't mean the kind of worship that we're talking about, right? And Jesus says, so it's a bit mystifying to some people. Well, why did Jesus say that to Satan in the desert? The reason is because he's saying you should worship God, but you serve him only. Because if you think that Jesus was saying there you should only offer proskuneo worship to God, then all of these people sin, including, by the way, people that Jesus mentions himself. Jesus himself tells the parable of the unmerciful servant who proskuneo worships before his master. In the book of Revelation, Jesus promises to his faithful believers that all of the other evil nations will one day proskuneo before them. Jesus says all of these people will worship you. That's out of the mouth of Jesus in the book of Revelation. So it cannot be that proskuneo worship is something that's only due to God. So in the book of Matthew, there are lots of instances of Jesus being worshipped. Mark, Luke, and John are totally unconcerned with worship. Matthew, it happens a lot. But I think you need to understand the context, which is that worshipping someone in the sense of proskuneo is something that people just did to a higher authority, someone who was of a higher status than you, like, I don't know, maybe being the Messiah.
Yeah.
You know, like, so it's no mystery to me, in other words, that Jesus would be worshipped in the sense of proskuneo. Today, when we say the word worship, we mean something a bit different. Also, here's an interesting, question. Riddle me this. If proskuneo worship is the kind of worship that's given to God and only God, then why is it that after Jesus ascends into heaven, nobody offers proskuneo worship
They offer
anymore? They don't. There's no instance of like there's the word proskuneo shows up, but Jesus is not given proskuneo worship. Like in the book of Acts, for example, the disciples are going around and they're not going around offering proskuneo to Jesus up in heaven. Why? Why not? In my view, it's because proskuneo is just a physical action. It describes a physical behavior of bowing down, prostrating before someone who's of a higher authority.
If someone's not there, you can't do it.
If it were to mean like cultic religious worship due to God, then they would keep doing it after he ascended into heaven, but they don't. And there are instances, so Christians will dispute this again because they'll say, like in the book of Acts, somebody bows down before Peter, they proskuneo before Peter the apostle, and Peter says, "Get up, because I'm just a human like you." And they say, see, so Peter's saying that you don't worship other humans, you only worship God. But I don't think that's what Peter was saying. I think he was saying, get up. He says, I am also just a man, as in I'm the same status as you. Like I'm not your authority. Like worship God. He's our authority.
The other type of worship for some
Pause there.
Yeah. Again, the thought that this proskuneo is the only way to worship in the Greek language is just untrue. That just he keeps focusing on this word. He's saying it so much over and over again, almost to like get it stuck. This is the only way. This is the only way in which we can worship Jesus, which is just untrue. I mean, and if he says we don't see in the New Testament, of course we do. When Paul says every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Is that not proskuneo? Is that not bowing down? Like so. And that's not just the goal is proskuneo. Like I get what he's saying that it's used towards other figures. But the point is the act of worship and confession of Jesus being Lord. And who is Lord? The point is God will share his glory with no one. And yet Jesus talks about the glory that he shared with the Father before the creation of the world. Right? So Jesus is like, can we go back to that in John 17, the prayer of the glory that he had with the Father before the creation of the world? One more thing. I love that he mentions Revelation. And it's like, wait, doesn't Revelation begin with Jesus saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the first and the last? Like,
Though I died, I will live forever.
no, I die, I'll live forevermore. But who's the Alpha and the Omega? Doesn't God in Isaiah acknowledge him? He's the Alpha and the Omega?
Yeah.
What is Jesus doing then if he's claiming to be the Alpha and the Omega? So now, wait, I thought Revelation, according to Alex, was irrelevant. But when he wants to quote Revelation and say, see, it's being used in other ways or it's not being used in Revelation.
Yeah.
So now Revelation is relevant?
That's what's funny is there was an earlier part that we didn't hit the timestamp because just for the sake of time, but he kind of hand waves away the accounts of the birth of Jesus and Mary, the angels, all of that, and he basically is like well, that's all mythology. And by the way, also like Revelation, I don't trust that as historical. That's also mythology. So it's like anytime that something makes a powerful case against your point, you just kind of say that's not real. We don't look at that. That's like mythology. Now back to my narrow parameters. This I think is kind of a motif in terms of the way that Alex will frame something. Is he'll set a really, really specific narrow parameter that excludes the full picture, and then operate within that narrow parameter to try to show that there's some insufficiency. He's doing it here with worship by trying to reduce it down to 2 words and then ultimately saying this one word is the only word that is used of Jesus. And as you just said, ignoring the fact that there's all kinds of demonstrations of people worshiping Jesus, whether or not that word is used. Yes, that's the first point. He'll do the same thing when it comes to the what David Wood calls the exact words criterion. Did Jesus say, "It is I, God, from heaven, and now my name is Jesus, and I am incarnated, and I am part of the Trinity"? Bing, full stop. No, Jesus didn't. It does not meet that exact sentence that you are wanting him to say. However, he also never says the exact opposite of that sentence. It is I, Jesus, and I am not God. So if you're going to use the exact words criterion and you apply it to that, you also don't have that. You don't have him saying that he isn't. What you have to do is actually use reason. Frankly, this is the same thing that he did in his critique of Wes Huff on Joe Rogan and the Great Isaiah Scroll. And wait a second, he said it was word for word, and it's only 99% word for word. And he'll focus in on that 1% rather than acknowledging how absolutely impressive it is that there is a 99% match with a 1,000-year gap in between, and that it is absolutely verified historically that the Great Isaiah Scroll is time-stamped before the existence of Jesus and contains the amazing prophetic material that is fulfilled in the life of Jesus. All of that gets thrown under the rug, and we focus in on, again, this narrow 1% and say, he said word for word, and it's actually 99% word for word. This is kind of the paradigm. Anybody listening to this, I'm going to break the fourth wall and look at the camera here. Anybody listening to this, read the Gospel of Mark. If we want to go off of just the Gospel of Mark, beautiful. It's the shortest one. It's the easiest one to read. You can probably read it in like an hour. Just sit down today, carve out some time. You've got an hour, listen to it in the gym, whatever, and actually listen or read through the Gospel of Mark. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Josiah's word for it. Don't take Alex's word for it. Read it for yourself, and it will be abundantly clear to you what is stated in the Gospel of Mark in terms of the worship that Jesus receives, the miracles that Jesus does. I love the HANDS acronym. I've talked about this in other videos, but let me put it this way: the honors that Jesus receives that are due to God. Jesus possesses the attributes of God. Jesus bears the names of God. Jesus does the deeds that only God does, and Jesus occupies the seat of God's throne. That's HANDS. That's an acronym. That's HANDS, and it's all absolutely crystal clear in the book of Mark. So if you're only getting your understanding of this filtered through a YouTube video of Alex and about the Bible, that's a mistake. Also, if you're getting it about Christian reacts to Alex O'Connor, that's also a mistake. Literally read the book of Mark if you want to start there, or the book of John, like whatever. Like I have no problem with Mark. Mark is awesome. Like I said, I'm reading Mark right now. I read Mark this morning. Mark is phenomenal and crystal clear as it relates to the divinity of Jesus.